Hey folks, welcome back to Professor Foot's Tiny Corner Office. Oh, I guess I don't need these. I have a quick lecture today around a few ideas that we're reading a lot about, but I thought it'd be nice to build kind of a simpler foundation for a few of these ideas and some that don't get covered quite as much as I would hope. So I have some slides around ego networks and network perceptions. So first, talking about ego networks, what these are, I think of it as like the parts of a network that we can see. So ego means the self, and so it's like self-centered networks. And so sometimes these are the only kinds of network data that we can get. So if we think about the social network of the world and how we perceive it, really all we can perceive is our own ego network. We know the people that we know, right? Like if you ask who my friends are, I can make a list of them. And often we know which of them are friends with each other. So that's sort of the two types of edges that are typically included in like an ego network as we would often define it. And so where do these come from? Surveys. So just like I said, if I was going to list my friends, that would be an ego network. My friends and which of them are friends with each other. Sometimes it can be an extraction from a complete network. So I'll show what this looks like in just a second. If we did know, for example, all of the friendships in a sorority or in a classroom, we could look at the ego network for one of the people that we had information on. And usually, like I said, it includes ego and everyone one step and the connections between them, but not anything further than that. So as a quick example, imagine we had a full network that looked like this. This is the karate network that we've looked at a few times, the Zachary Karate Club. It's actually from one of the earliest social network studies, looking at how this club, these two friendships sort of, or two friendship groups that you can already kind of see here in this graph, broke into, sort of one over here and one over here, kind of broke the karate club up. So that's where this data comes from. So this is what the full network looks like. An ego network, I just sort of chose a node at random and then highlighted based on the distance from the ego. And so the ego is this kind of reddish color, and then every one that's one step away is green, 2 is blue, and 3 is purplish. So this is a version of an ego network that uses kind of color to highlight distance from. But often all we have, or the way that we compose them, is to kind of chop everyone else out of the network. And so this is that same thing, but filtered only to the people that ego knows. And so ego's in the center. Ego is the kind of the red in the center here. And then everyone that they know or that they're friends with, and how they are friends with each other. So even here, just if you look at your friends and how they're friends with each other, there is information to be had, and sometimes some really useful information. You used to be able to, I know that students don't use Facebook as much anymore. Facebook used to let you get your friend graph and who was connected to all of your friends, there's really a lot there. It was very easy for me, for example, to see, these are my friends from when I went to college. These are my friends from my hometown, etc. And you can see this structure, right? Because they all are friends with each other, but not friends across groups. Maybe I'll see if we can do something. I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but that's more open now, and maybe we can do some data gathering there. But anyway, so that's an ego network. That's what it looks like. That's how it's characterized. So what can we learn from them? What can we measure about ego networks? We can't measure everything, right? There are things that we don't know about how they interact with a larger network, but we can do things like figure out the degree centrality. That's the size of the network, how many friends I have. The density. So again, these are measures that we will talk about more. They're things that we can measure in R, but it's good to have a basic understanding of them as well. You've seen them already. You'll continue to see them. Density is how many of the possible edges that exist actually exist. And so, one, a density of one would mean that all of my friends are friends with each other. A density of zero would mean that none of my friends, well, it's actually impossible. It would mean that none of my friends are friends with each other or friends with me, right? And I guess that's maybe a fair point, is that you don't necessarily have to include ego in these ego nets. Sometimes it's more instructive to drop that person because they'll be connected to everyone, right? So they kind of clutter up the graph. So if you drop them and their edges, then you can kind of see the connections between the people in the graph a little bit better. And so in that case, you could have a density of zero. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but the idea behind density is the proportion of total edges that could exist that do exist. You can see groups in an ego network, like I mentioned, my college group and my hometown group, my West Lafayette group, etc. Distance, so how far away, like how spread out are people on average. Again, the maximum that they'll be is like, well, I guess if you include ego, it's always like 2 from each other, right? 1 to ego and 1 more step to the other person. Yeah, if you don't include ego, that actually could be fairly spread out. Homogeneity. So this is something, I mean, that's very simple in an ego graph, but it's like how similar are, how many of my friends are, male or female, etc. And then homophily, how likely are people in my graph to be connected to each other based on their attributes. We talked a lot about homophily, in composition. I actually don't remember what I meant when I wrote composition in here. I don't see what the difference is. I guess between homogeneity and composition, you could, it's not necessarily, it seems like a pretty similar idea, but how much of my graph is composed of college professors, what's the kind of the composition of my friends. That's probably what I meant. Okay, so how can we use this network data? So you can do things like look at changes over time and comparison by location to do things like predict individual outcomes. So you can see, look at how things change, but you can say, do people that have a large ego network that have lots of friends and a dense one, right, where they're really part of a dense, tight group, they actually often have better mental health outcomes. It's sort of an indicator that you have people that you can go to for health. So that's an example. Employment. Similarly, there's actually, we will talk in depth about this. There's actually a great study that talks about how having a close-knit network is actually less helpful for employment. This is actually one of the most cited studies in social sciences. It's Mark Granovetter's paper, but that what you really want for employment is actually information. And if everyone already knows in your group, we'll talk a lot about this, if everyone in your group knows each other, then they all have the same information, redundant information. And what you really want are people that don't know each other, because that means they're part of other groups that have different information. And so you look to those people who are different from you to get information. And so your ego network, if they're not connected, it can tell you may actually have better employment opportunities and happiness for a lot of the same reasons. So that's ego networks. That's kind of the idea behind them. I want to tie that in to this idea of network perception. This is, so I guess the first idea to tie that in is that ego networks are the part of the network that we perceive, right? That we don't know. We may know some of the friends of friends, that are some of the, people, some of our friends' friends, but they certainly have friends that we don't know, right? Their networks extend beyond kind of the view that we have of them, beyond our vision. And so, but even here, even when we talk just about ego networks, there's reason to think that our perceptions of our ego networks are not completely correct. So along a lot of dimensions, we've found that there's this ton of work actually by these three, Bernard, Kilworth, and Saylor, looking at people's perceptions, like self-reported, of what they did, who they talked to. They built networks like who did you talk to this week? And they found that overall people were just wildly wrong. A quote from one of their papers, kind of a summary paper in 1982, right in the abstract, it says, what people say about their communications bears no resemblance to their behavior. And so, that seems problematic for a lot of researchers. But who cares? It's like people don't. So people misremember who they talk to at work. That's no big deal. But they and others have also found that even things like friendship are not mutual, right? That even in many cases, like probably something like a third of friendships, when you ask someone, okay, who are your friends? Make a list of people that you consider your friends. On average, something like a third of those people will not list you, right? So even something that where we think of it as being pretty well defined, we know who our friends are. They know that we're friends. We're often wrong. We're often wrong. And some of that may be just having, different definitions of friendship, or that you're sort of on the border, like, are they my friend? I don't know. I guess I'll write them down, and maybe they made the opposite decision. But the point is that these relationships are not always as clear as we think, and that our perceptions influence a lot of how we see the world and see our networks. And so what are the kind of implications of this? One is that, we need to understand that perceptions, it's not, our networks influence us, but partially it's mediated by our perceptions of them. Who we go to for social support depends on us seeing them as a friend and thinking that they see us as a friend, right? And so when our perceptions are wrong, it changes our actions. Ned Smith and colleagues talk about this idea of potential networks versus activated networks. And so a potential network is the people who are in your network in some capability, people that you could go to for information, for help, for social support. And then the activated network is once you actually need information or help or social support, who do you think of? Who might you go to? And they found that along some SES dimensions, people with lower SES would like winnow their groups, and when there were stresses, or when they had, I'm trying to remember the exact details, but the basic idea is that that sort of the rich get richer may be driven in part by network perceptions, that those who have already lower stresses in their lives are better able to kind of think broadly about their networks and to identify people who might be able to help them or give them resources. While those who are already stressed and already in difficult circumstances often winnow their networks and think only of those who are already close to them, and therefore are maybe less likely to gain the kind of breadth of support that others do. And so leading to kind of greater disparity in the future. And that might be, one partial explanation for some of the disparities that we see in outcomes. Okay. So that's sort of a very quick introduction to network perception and some of the some of the ways that people have talked about it. There's a lot more. One piece of research set of research that I find really fascinating is work by Matt Brashears. I'm actually not sure how he pronounces it, but where he's been looking at like how people compress network information and make assumptions about a network in order to sort of navigate it. So, for example, if we know that A and B are friends, we're more likely to think that, A and B are friends and B and C are friends. We think that A and C know each other and are friends, right? It's sort of a compression heuristic that our brains do when we're thinking about networks, even though it may not be true. We know that as we talked about, this is the principle of kind of triadic closure or transitivity, and it often is true. And so this kind of truth gets turned into a heuristic that our brains use that makes that assumption that it's always true. So that's kind of a neat area of research I didn't really talk much about, but I think it's also cool that if you're interested, there are some great research on sort of the kind of cognitive aspects of network perception. Okay, so what can we do now that we know that there are these biases, and different problems, weaknesses in the way we perceive networks. what can we do? One is to get information from others. And so depending on the context, this may be easy or weird or awkward, but sometimes we can build a picture of the whole network or build a picture of what other people think. And that can be, as simple as asking other people, like, who, and we do this all the time, actually. This is a part of our lives as social beings, is figuring out networks, right? Like, we want to figure out who is dating who is friends with who is enemies now, who had a fight. And part of that is that we really, like, it's really important for us to build these maps of the world, of the social world. But there are also ways to do this more systematically. So Crackhard et al. Did surveys, asking people, is this person friends with this person? Is this person friends with this person? Sort of built a whole matrix. And then you aggregate those and there's a lot of ways to do it, but like take the average. If 50% of people say these two people are friends, then we consider them friends. So you can do it that way. You can think as an individual in terms of potential networks and activation and mobilization that you can sort of overcome some of these biases by recognizing when you are in like a high stress situation, to recognize when you need social support, when you need information, and to think, instead of thinking who you think of first, when you think who could I go to for help, take a step back and think broader. Think, who else could I go to? Are there other people in my network that I'm not thinking of? Just recognizing that is a bias. And recognizing finally, I talked about this with Mark Granovetter, but that sometimes the people that we don't think about are the people who could be most beneficial to us, that we may have weak ties, people we only sort of know, but who might be perfect for the sort of information or help that we need. So that's it. Thanks, and talk to you soon.